Yes, this is it. SpaceX just became a $1.8 trillion company, the biggest IPO in history. And Flight 13? It's only weeks away. But here's the twist. To be worth that much, Starship needs to fly almost 3 times a day by 2028. Right now, it's flown once. So is this the future of space, or the riskiest bet ever made? Stick around. Here's everything that's riding on this flight. Let's start with the number that should be impossible. In a presentation this week, SpaceX showed a chart projecting how much mass it expects to send to orbit year by year. Through 2027, the line barely moves. It's so small on that scale that every payload humanity has ever launched wouldn't even register as a single pixel. Then, 2028 hits, and the line jumps to roughly 200,000 tons. In 1 year. Do the math on that, and it gets stranger. If that mass is carried by Starship version 4, each one hauling 200 tons per flight, you're looking at 1,000 launches in 2028 alone. That's almost 3 launches every single day for an entire year. Right now, the version that has to carry that future, version 3, the same vehicle Flight 13 will fly, has made exactly 1 flight so far, and that flight ran into issues with both the booster and the engines. So there are 2 ways to read that chart. Either SpaceX is about to attempt the fastest production and launch ramp in the history of transportation, or that slide was built to look good during the single biggest week SpaceX has ever had on Wall Street. And this was that week, just to put that 200,000 tons in perspective. That's roughly the weight of 2 of the U.S. Navy's largest aircraft carriers, leaving the ground, reaching orbit in a single year. For context, the total mass every national space agency on Earth has launched to orbit across the entire history of spaceflight combined is a small fraction of that number. SpaceX is proposing to match decades of global space activity in 1 year. The next test flight, the real business, space-based AI. The next data point arrives soon. Booster 20 just finished full cryogenic proof testing, and Ship 40 has all 6 of its Raptor 3 engines installed, with a static fire campaign next. SpaceX President Gwynne Shotwell told CNBC this week that this flight could happen in about a month, and that whether SpaceX can finally push Starship to orbit depends on how it goes. And here's the tell. The hardware for the flight after this one is already taking shape on the production line. SpaceX isn't waiting for a result before placing its next bet. That tells you how confident SpaceX is. But confidence doesn't justify a $1 trillion valuation. Revenue does. And the revenue story SpaceX told this week has almost nothing to do with rockets. Here's where it gets interesting. This week, SpaceX's communications team, alongside a satellite engineer and Elon Musk himself, walked through growth projections that have nothing to do with how many ships fly, and everything to do with why anyone would pay $1.8 trillion for this company in the first place. Start in Bastrop, Texas, where SpaceX currently builds Starlink user terminals in a facility just over 1 million square feet. The plan, multiply that by 11. 11 million square feet producing not just terminals, but the solar cells, wafers, and ingots needed to power an entirely new category of satellite, plus the satellites themselves. Then there's a second facility planned for Grimes County, designed to be roughly 10 times the size of Tesla's Gigafactory. Its stated purpose: build what SpaceX is calling the largest chip fabrication line in history. To put that in perspective, Tesla's Gigafactory is already one of the largest manufacturing buildings on the planet. A facility 10 times that size would put SpaceX in the same conversation as the biggest dedicated chip manufacturers on Earth, companies that have spent decades and tens of billions of dollars reaching that scale. Here's the simplest way to picture what's actually happening. SpaceX isn't just building rockets anymore. It's building a data center, except the data center is in orbit. The server racks are satellites, the power plant is a solar array, and the network cable is a laser. And Starship is the delivery truck that gets all of it up there. The first of these satellites, called AI-1, is expected to launch by the end of 2027 using the same deployment system as Starlink. The first generation flies with NVIDIA chips, with SpaceX's own chips slotting in once that second facility is running. Here's a comparison that actually helps. Fully unfolded, with solar panels extended, one of these satellites spans about 70 meters. That's roughly the length of a fully stacked Falcon 9, just a bit shorter than the entire Super Heavy booster. 2 solar arrays on a single satellite, producing 150 kilowatts combined. Based on the power-to-mass numbers SpaceX shared, that puts each satellite at a little over 2 tons. Pack 60 of them into one Starship cargo bay, and you're moving roughly 128 tons of orbital data center hardware in a single launch. Now, the obvious reaction to all of this is skepticism, and honestly, that's fair. A constellation of satellites doing AI computing in orbit sounds like science fiction. But here's the thing worth sitting with. People said almost exactly that about Starlink. Tens of thousands of satellites, beaming internet to the whole planet, paying for a rocket program. It sounded absurd. It's now SpaceX's most reliable source of cash. The difference this time is that the demand for compute already exists, right now, today, on the ground. It's the reason graphics cards for gaming got more expensive. Companies are starving for chips and compute power and already paying premium prices for it on Earth. SpaceX is betting it can sell that same compute from orbit, where there's unlimited sunlight, no power grid to share, and no land to lease. So, if the business model has a real foundation, the question becomes, can SpaceX actually build all of this on the timeline it just announced? For that answer, you don't look at a slide. You look at what's happening on the ground in Texas, right now, with the rocket that already works. But before we leave orbit, there's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding because it explains how these satellites talk to anyone at all. They won't carry much in the way of traditional communications hardware. Instead, they'll use laser links, beaming data sideways to the thousands of Starlink satellites already flying in lower orbits, which then relay it down to ground stations. In other words, the constellation SpaceX spent years building to sell internet access becomes the relay network for an entirely new business, selling computing power from space. The reusability proof. This week, Falcon 9 quietly set a new reuse record, and almost nobody outside the space world noticed. One booster completed its 35th flight and landing, touching down on a recovery ship out in the ocean. Its very first flight was over 5 years ago, carrying a cargo mission to the International Space Station. 5 years. 35 flights. Still going. It wasn't alone. Another booster landed on its 34th flight, the closest any other booster has come to that record. A third came in on its 27th flight. Add a fourth landing from a booster making its 10th flight, and that's 4 successful Falcon 9 catches in a single week, with recovery ships racing to keep up. Here's why this matters. The 1,000 launch number for 2028 sounds impossible if you think SpaceX needs to build 1,000 new ships. But that's not how Falcon 9 got here. SpaceX didn't build 35 rockets to get one booster to fly 35 times. They built one rocket and flew it 35 times. If Starship follows anything close to that curve, the production target stops being about building a massive fleet and starts being about how fast each ship can be turned around and reflown. And that's exactly what the next piece of construction at Starbase is for. A new mega assembly building with 24 workstations, a chunk of them for inspecting, repairing, and upgrading ships and boosters that have already flown. SpaceX is building the maintenance hangar for an airline before the airline has more than a couple of planes. Here's the part that doesn't show up in a headline. Every time a Falcon 9 booster flies again instead of getting scrapped, that's tens of millions of dollars that didn't need to be spent building a new one. Multiply that across 35 flights, and you start to see why reusability isn't just a neat trick. It's the financial engine that makes a number like 1,000 Starship launches a year even thinkable. Without it, that chart from the start of this video isn't aggressive. It's fictional. With it, the chart stops being a fantasy and starts being a spreadsheet. The ground game. So, if reusability is the proven part of this story, and the chip and satellite business is the funding part, there's one piece left, and it's the hardest to fake with a slide deck: the ground itself. And this week, all 3 pads SpaceX is working on had news. Start with the pad that will actually launch the next flight. Both catch arms just got their rails reinstalled, swapped for a lighter design, with the old, heavier rails left sitting on the ground nearby. Dampers removed earlier were spotted on a truck, ready for reinstallation. Workers also pulled, serviced, and reinstalled more than half of the tower's 12 mechanical skates, the parts that let its carriage ride up and down. Look closely at the arms, and you'll spot bright patches where paint's been stripped for new steel reinforcement. None of this is cosmetic. This tower is being reinforced for a cadence it hasn't handled yet. Then there's the second pad, being built essentially from the ground up. This week, the first concrete went into the ground, the base of a trench that will carry fuel and other commodities into an underground bunker, tied with rebar and poured. Another layer for the bunker's foundation is already being laid above it, and steel trench segments for the rest of that network are stacking up on site. Here's a detail that quietly answers a question that's been hanging for weeks. Where is all the natural gas coming from? To make the methane Starship burns? SpaceX has now filed to build a new 16-inch pipeline running all the way from a nearby port. That pipeline almost certainly taps into a massive liquid natural gas export terminal that already exists in the region. From there, the gas gets liquefied on site, run through a methane generation plant that strips out everything else, and stored in tank farms, ready for the next flight. Here's why that detail matters more than it sounds. A 16-inch pipeline doesn't get built for 1 or 2 launches a year. It gets built for a facility that expects to be burning through enormous quantities of methane, constantly, for years. SpaceX isn't just preparing for the next flight. It's quietly building the fuel supply chain for the cadence in that 1,000-launch chart. And in Florida, something easy to miss showed up. The first section of a brand new launch tower, lifted onto its base. SpaceX confirmed it's keeping the old naming scheme used at that site for decades. Gwynne Shotwell even floated in that same CNBC interview that the flight after next could be the first Starship to launch from this new pad. So here's where we are. A chip factory roughly 10 times the size of a gigafactory. A reuse record suggesting the production math might genuinely work. Every piece of this trillion-dollar bet is physically happening in concrete and steel right now, not just on a slide. The NASA twist. There's one more piece of news from this week that ties directly back to everything we just covered, and it didn't come from SpaceX. It came from NASA. At its Artemis III briefing this week, alongside naming the 4 astronauts for the mission, NASA confirmed something that quietly connects to this entire story. The lunar lander for Artemis III is now built on version 3 Starship. The same vehicle, the same production line, the same test flights happening at Starbase right now. For years, the plan called for a separate, purpose-built lander, its own hardware, its own flight history, developed on its own track. That separate track is gone. Every version 3 Starship rolling off that production line, every cryo test, every static fire, every flight, whether it's carrying Starlink satellites, AI, data center hardware, or nothing at all, is now also lunar lander hardware. Think about what that does to the picture from earlier. That 1,000 launch chart for 2028? If even a fraction of those flights are version 3 Starships, racking up flight time, landings, and refurbishments, NASA's lunar lander program isn't running on its own separate budget and timeline anymore. It's riding along on SpaceX's commercial cadence, for free. Every satellite deployment doubles as a lunar lander test flight. That's either the smartest piece of program consolidation in the history of NASA contracting, or it's SpaceX quietly making its moon lander dependent on the exact same vehicle that has to fly almost 3 times a day by 2028 for the IPO math to work. One delay, one grounding, one design issue on version 3, and it doesn't just slow down satellite deployments and orbital data centers anymore. It slows down the moon landing too. So here's where everything actually lands. A $1.8 trillion valuation. A production target that requires near-daily Starship flights within 2 years. A chip and satellite business that needs that same vehicle to scale. And now, a moon landing quietly tied to the same single piece of hardware. Every thread in this story, the satellites, the chips, the launch pads, the pipeline, the IPO, and now the moon, runs through one vehicle. If version 3 Starship works, all of it works together. If it doesn't, all of it stalls together. And this is where the IPO timing gets almost poetic. SpaceX didn't go public after proving any of this works. It went public this week, in the middle of building all of it, betting that investors would rather buy in now at $1.8 trillion than wait and find out for certain later. With that much riding on one piece of hardware, here's the real question worth sitting with. Is this $1.8 trillion valuation pricing in a company with 4 separate businesses? Or one business, wearing 4 different names? That's the full picture, 4 bets riding on one vehicle. Thanks for analyzing this with us, it's appreciated. Like, share, comment your take, and subscribe to the Space Brief. Tap the screen for more.